And each of these speakers is sort of the leaders in the field of non-invasive brain stimulation with different modalities. So we're talking about electrical stimulation, magnetic stimulation, photonic stimulation, called photobiomodulation, and also ultrasound stimulation. Marvin Bixen wasn't able to join us today, but we're lucky to have Vince Clark here, who is one of the other leaders using transcranial direct current stimulation. If you've read any of the popular press on some of the science, you've probably read about Vince's work. He's published some of the best studies with some of the best effect sizes with direct current stimulation. Dr. Clark is a professor of psychology and director of the Psychology Clinical Neuroscience Center at the University of New Mexico, and he's going to tell you about direct current stimulation.
Thank you, Jay. As Jay mentioned, Marvin Bixen was supposed to be giving this talk. He's really sorry he can't be here, but his son got just sick enough to keep him from getting on the plane, which he found out at the airport as he was about to get on the plane, but everybody's okay. So what is brain stimulation? For those of you that don't know, the general principle is using some form of energy transmitted into the body to interact with the nervous system to alter how it behaves. And by altering nervous system function, you alter behavior. Based on the idea that the nervous system controls behavior, the behavior depends on nervous system function, this idea of mind-body supervenience. The nervous system itself is a physical system. If we make that assumption, and assume that the nervous system controls behavior, therefore, if you alter the physical state of the nervous system, that has a potential to alter behavior. It doesn't always work, believe me, but the right thing in the right way at the right time can produce a change in behavior. And depending on the kinds of changes you're shooting for, say a decrease in symptoms of mental illness, an increase in performance in a memory task or an attention task or something like that, done the right way, it can actually produce really profound changes in behavior. So the idea of using electricity or magnetism to alter the nervous system is not a new one. It really started, at least in what you might consider the modern age. It goes back thousands of years, actually, but Galvani, after inventing the battery, immediately applied it to test animals and realized that he could make frog legs twitch. And I happened to be in Bologna last summer, and they have a statue to him in one of the plazas. There he is with his frog legs, and he realized that a small electric current would make frog legs twitch, and he called this animal magnetism. Eventually, that turned into our understanding of how the nervous system works. A pivotal point in our developing that understanding was Galvani's work. His nephew, Aldini, did the same thing with recently deceased humans, and you can imagine how freaked out people were when he got dead people to talk and move. Moving forward, as early as 1870, it became clear that it depended on the polarity of current, what effects you got. Surface positive currents could stimulate, and surface negative currents could inhibit brain function. Fritsch and Higsig saw that in 1870. Terzullo and Bullock, about a century later, did a series of studies with crayfish. And my connection to Ted Bullock is I trained in graduate school just across the street here, starting 3 decades ago. 3 decades before that, Ted Bullock was applying electric fields to crayfish. And he's a very intelligent, interesting man. I think there's a biography of him on the Society for Neuroscience website. I would suggest you look at it. He was an incredible guy. He thought from the work that they did that the crayfish, at least, seemed to be set up in a way that it was sensitive to the application of electrical fields, that its nervous system was actually designed in such a way to be receptive to ambient electric fields, either generated within the crayfish or maybe outside, that would alter nervous system function. So when we talk about why does applying a small electric current to the nervous system have an effect, It may be because the nervous system is actually designed to be receptive to that. Maybe. And then after that, a number of other studies. It wasn't until 1981 that really the first real TDCS study was performed. Since then, a lot more work. Now, transcranial direct current stimulation, what does transcranial mean? That means that you have to get that energy through at least 8 separate layers between the air and the brain itself. It's not easy, and many of these layers are actually quite resistive to electric current. Magnetism is a bit easier. Magnetism flows through these layers with much less hindrance or impedance than electric current does. Intercranial stimulation is another option where you actually implant electrodes into the brain to stimulate brain regions directly. Now, there's many advantages to this. If you get it in exactly the right spot, you can do very precise stimulation of very tiny pieces of anatomy in the nervous system. A lot of remarkable things can be done this way. People recovering from neurological illnesses that are otherwise untreatable get up off the operating table and walk when they haven't been able to walk for years before that. But it's also dangerous. You're putting a hole in the skull, you're implanting something into the brain. There is a danger there, and people do die from this periodically. Also, it's quite expensive, tens of thousands of dollars to get it done. TDCS and other transcranial systems are much less expensive, ultimately much less dangerous. So in my lab, we focus mostly on transcranial work, but I don't mean to disparage. In some cases, really incredible things can happen with intracranial stimulation. The modern day of transcranial direct current stimulation, the interest in it really developed after work by Nietzsche and Paulus in Göttingen, Germany, where they showed that you could stimulate the brain magnetically and record the results of that from the arm. So you stimulate the brain, and that generates action potential volley that produces an electric current that you can record from the arm. It's a very objective measure of brain excitability. What they showed is that they could modulate that with electric current. And a positive electric current increased the magnitude of what you recorded from the arm, and a negative electric current reduced it, just like they thought they saw in 1870, the same kind of basic principle. So if you want to make the brain more excitable, you apply an anodal positive current, and with, if you want to make it less excitable, negative cathodal current. And why does this work? You know, there's a lot of hand-waving in neuroscience, and I have to admit, we don't understand all of this. But what it appears to depend on is when you apply an electric field, that forces ions to move across that field. So positive ions will move towards a negative pole and away from a positive pole, and vice versa. A neuron is an enclosed system. It's a leaky bag of ions. But the ions within it have a difficult time coming out of the neuron. So if you apply a current to a neuron, those ions will move to one end of the neuron and get stuck there, whereas the ions outside of the neuron are allowed to flow through the extracellular matrix. That changes the membrane potential of that neuron, and that change in membrane potential essentially alters its ability to produce action potentials. So either up or down, depending on the physics of the situation. So what I want to talk about now are a series of studies that we did, and where this came from was my interest in the development of attention in humans. I think in an evolutionary sense, our necessity to identify animals hidden around us that were trying to hide from us was an essential part of our development of more sophisticated attentional perceptual processes to be able to identify them. So unless an animal is poisonous, they typically try and hide. They blend in with their environment. And our ancestors, trying to find those animals to eat, had to learn to identify them. They also had to run from animals trying to hide from us that were going to eat us, like lions and tigers, snakes. Believe it or not, there's a snake in the right-hand image. If you look really closely, you can see it in this image. It blends in perfectly. If those snakes are dangerous or poisonous, if we don't notice them, we die. So our perceptual system has to get very fine-tuned to be able to identify really subtle features to do that. So I became interested in that, and we got some money from the Department of Defense to develop this hidden object learning task. And I'll show you some examples in a second. We did multimodal imaging trying to identify what brain areas were involved in learning to perform that task. Once we identified those networks, we applied TDCS to those networks to see if we could modify learning to identify hidden camouflaged objects. So some examples are here. So somewhere in this image, and this was DoD funded, so we came up with the learning task that DoD was interested in, which is basically things trying to kill you in the Middle East, in a nutshell. So somewhere in this image is a clue that there's something that might hurt you. Any ideas what it might be? Sorry? It's actually to the side. There's a sniper in there. Yeah, okay, yep, that's it. There's something here. Does anyone see it? Very good. You guys are good. Okay, yep, there's a sniper. And this one's tougher. Although if you've seen me talk before, you might know it that way. So there's a bomb under the car. So when you first see these things, they look fairly normal. You don't know they're threatening, really. But with learning, you learn to identify those objects. And so this was what's called a discovery learning task. People got very little information going into it about what the threats look like and so on. They had to discover it. So they'd get an image like the one on the left, and it either had a threat or didn't. They'd have to say, yes, no, I see the threat or not. And then they'd get a movie as a feedback. And if the threat was present and they said, no, I don't see a threat, the movie would show the threat happening. In this case, someone being shot because if you look closely, and again, there's a shadow of a sniper right here, like you saw before. So they go through a series of trials like that, and we would track their performance, their improvement in performance as they learned. First, we did an imaging study. So we looked at their responses to stimuli, both with functional MRI and magnetoencephalography before training. We trained them to an intermediate level, imaged again, trained to an expert level, and imaged a third time. And we looked at the effects of training on these responses. So this shows the bold fMRI response across a group of subjects at the novice stage before training, and then at an intermediate stage after they're trained to about 78% accuracy. It's a forced choice, two-option task, so random would be 50%, and perfect would be 100%. So the range is basically 50 to 100%. So halfway there is about 78%. Now, this is the difference between the response to objects with threats present versus threats absent. And at the novice stage, pretty much the whole brain responds, or a lot of different brain areas respond to the threats. After training, interestingly, most of that activity goes to the frontal cortex. And in visual cortex, there's actually a reduction in response to threats versus non-threats. Even though it's a visual task, it's like the visual cortex is being downregulated somehow by this task. So we look for areas close to the scalp surface where we could put electrodes. And in a nutshell, we found that with 2 milliamps of current applied over right inferior frontal cortex here for 30 minutes, people were able to double their ability to learn the task with the same amount of training. So that generated a lot of questions. One of them was, can we replicate the effects? And the answer is we could. We looked at a new group of subjects, got pretty much the same result, a doubling of learning rate. We tried different current strengths and found a roughly linear effect of current strength. So the more current we gave people over right inferior frontal cortex, the more they learned. We gave all the experiment to another research group. This was Raja Parasuraman's group at George Mason University. Raj has since passed away. He was an incredible cognitive neuroscientist, a great loss, but before that. They took our stimuli, collected data independently, analyzed it, and got basically the same results. And they added a 24-hour delay. And what they found was that that learning effect lasts for at least 24 hours after TDCS is turned off. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that their brains are still responding to the TDCS. What it probably means is that they learned the task better while they were receiving TDCS and were able to maintain that learning at least 24 hours at an improved degree, if that makes sense. So an increase in response accuracy, a decrease in false alarms by about half, more than doubling of D prime, a signal detection measure, and no effect on beta, a measure of response bias. So there were, over a series of studies, what we found is that the fMRI data that we collected actually provides a very good guide for predicting the effects of TDCS. Where we stimulate in areas that respond more to the threats, we get an enhancement of learning. When we stimulate areas that respond less to threats, we see no effect on learning, showed by this red line here. But when we inhibit that area, supposedly, with cathodal current, we again see an improvement in learning. And when we stimulate the cerebellum, we see no significant effects. And in our original study, there was pretty much no response in the cerebellum. So if we stimulate areas that didn't show response or show a negative response, there's no effect on learning. If we stimulate areas that did show response, we see a big effect on learning, as much as a doubling of learning. So all of this and other things I don't have time to show you suggest that these effects are real. Looking across the literature, there are a number of different studies out now looking at different forms of cognition, different forms of memory, perception, and attention using TDCS. And across all of that, what we see is that the effects of TDCS on attention are the largest. So it seems easiest to manipulate attention with TDCS. My hypothesis about this is that TDCS is acting a lot like endogenous attention. It's manipulating activity in perceptual areas in a way that alters their function and then alters behavior. The most difficult to manipulate is working memory, which is unfortunate because working memory is involved in nearly everything we do. And being able to enhance that would be really useful. We can enhance it. And you can see on the right-hand side, we can also suppress all these functions as well. So we can reduce working memory, explicit and implicit memory, perception and attention, as well as enhance it, depending on how the electrodes are applied and so on. So brain stimulation is taking off. TDCS, a lot more papers each year, a lot more citations, a lot of interest. That interest has also moved into the commercial sector. So there's companies building and selling TDCS systems for private use. And there's actually quite a few of these systems. Also, some are FDA cleared for sale, and others are not FDA cleared. If you don't make any health, if you don't claim that there's health benefits, you're able to sell these devices as long as they don't kill anybody, which TDCS hasn't killed anyone that we know of. You can sell these things, and some of them are quite cheap. I wouldn't trust them, but they're out there. Another company that's selling these and marketing them is Halo Neuroscience. Halo has worked with the Olympic team and claims an improvement in things like strength and performance in Olympic athletes, which is pretty impressive. Now, why that happens is hard to say. And as far as I know, they haven't published any of this work, but they're selling quite a few of them at the same time for people that want performance enhancement. There's also other systems. This is a prototype system we have in the lab built by a company called Neuroelectrics. It can record up to 64 channels of EEG and stimulate up to 32 channels with arbitrary waveforms. So there's a lot we can do with that. Now, all of this, how society deals with technology, this is following a pattern that's referred to as a hype cycle. There's a technology is discovered or at least introduced widely, and there's a peak of inflated expectations. Everyone gets really excited about what it can do. Then it doesn't actually meet those high expectations, and then there's a trough of disillusionment. Both of those are unrealistic, either too high or too low. I think we're kind of rounding the top of that peak and coming down, and the reason I think that, There have been a few papers out lately, one of them by Horvath from Australia, saying that none of the cognitive effects of TDCS are replicable. Now, they didn't include our studies in their paper. If they did, they'd have to say there's at least one study out there that shows a replicable effect of TDCS on cognition. That's our study. But it's still early, and there's a lot of other reasons why they didn't see good effects here, I think, besides TDCS not working. There's also, you might have noticed about a year ago, a talk by Georgi Buzaki saying that very little current applied to the scalp gets into the brain. He used a cadaver head to do this. And again, there's a lot of problems here. One of them is cadavers, dead people, the materials in their head are quite different. After you die, things start to decompose, there are connectivity changes and so on. There may be a lot of reasons why he didn't see a lot of current getting into the brain. We ourselves have looked at brain chemistry and see that when we apply TDCS, we get a reasonably large enhancement of glutamate and glutamine and a significant effect on N-acetyl aspartate in the brain after TDCS is applied relative to before. So these are two neurochemicals associated with excitatory neurotransmission and metabolism, respectively. So applying anodal TDCS increases glutamate and glutamine, increases excitatory neurotransmission, and increases metabolism under the electrode, but not in the contralateral hemisphere. So we know the current's getting in there. We know it's having an effect. And it's a localized effect under the electrode, not in the rest of the brain. We've also seen changes in something called functional network connectivity. That takes a while to explain, but it's one way we can look at how the brain operates. Applying TDCS affects that. So moving forward, we have a lot of funded studies, and a few of them involve things that you might consider an aspect of consciousness. The first of these I want to discuss is mindfulness. And an interesting thing we found is that the TDCS protocol that enhances attention and enhances learning to identify threats, when we ask people, do you feel any different? They'd say no. People receiving TDCS versus a sham TDCS showed almost no differences. Even though it doubled their learning rate, they don't feel that different. They're not more attentive, not more jittery. Sometimes they say they're more tired, but not always. Except there were no changes unless the subjects had a prior practice of mindfulness meditation. And if you're not familiar with that, it's the idea of paying attention in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So people who practice this say that that same TDCS protocol that enhances learning to identify threats, weirdly, feels like a meditative state and feels like it a lot, like the second or third day of a 5-day retreat almost immediately for some people. So that really caught my attention. And along with Katie Wickowitz, we've had a number of projects funded to look at the effects of TDCS on mindfulness, both in expert mindfulness practitioners and also in novices to see if we can enhance people's ability to learn to practice mindfulness. So the idea is to have a regular group mindfulness session, but wearing TDCS electrodes. And doing that, in an early pilot study, we saw a reduction in smoking, which is one effect of learning mindfulness, with an effect size of about 0.95 in individuals receiving TDCS along with mindfulness. Now, we're following up on that in a larger study funded by NIAAA for drinking, for alcohol. We're also using these technologies to try and alter sleep. Using that neuroelectric system, we're recording slow wave sleep in the brain waves, extracting the phase and frequency for that individual of slow wave sleep and feeding that back in electrically. And what we see there is an enhancement of people's ability to recall items that they learned the previous evening after a night of sleeping, receiving that alternating current stimulation relative to sham. So by recording brainwaves during sleep and feeding a portion of those brainwaves back into the brain, it looks like we're able to enhance the mechanisms that those brainwaves indicate, in this case, consolidation of new information. Another interesting series of projects looks to reduce auditory hallucinations in schizophrenics. If you ask a schizophrenic what's the worst part of schizophrenia, a lot of them will say it's the voices in my head. And they're nasty, they tell you to kill people, that sort of thing. It turns out maybe 15% of voices that people hear are positive and supportive. The rest are horrible. And you can imagine 24 hours a day having someone in your head doing that to you, what that would be like. There's a group in France led by Brunelin that found that a TDCS protocol that can reduce people's reports of auditory hallucinations. And we managed to replicate their results. They found about a 30% reduction in hallucinations. We saw pretty much the same thing. Also, and this is work headed up by Bob Toma at University of New Mexico, we found a reduction in the brain's response to real voices after receiving that protocol. And also with magnetoencephalography, a reduction in activity in auditory cortex. So it looks like this protocol is actually reducing activity in auditory cortex in a way that reduces people's perception of these disembodied voices in their head. One last thing I want to leave you with. I've talked about a few protocols today. How many different ways are there to apply direct current to the brain? If you multiply all the options for electrode location, size, number, current strength, current polarity, and current duration, that number is between 4 million and 8 trillion. Quite a few, depending on how finely incremented each of those variables are. If you then modulate the waveform, so you can have alternating current, different frequencies, random noise, and so on, it can go up to 890 quintillion options. This is a lot of opportunities to do something. Besides that, you have magnetic stimulation, ultrasound, light, even physical pressure, and things like meditation, mindfulness, all ways to modify activity in the nervous system. And really an infinite variety of ways. There's a lot of opportunities here to be able to alter brain function. We'll hear next in this session about ultrasound on the bottom and magnetic stimulation, not TMS, but a different version of magnetic stimulation. But each of them has different properties. Ultrasound has potentially the opportunity to deal with or manipulate very tiny pieces of cortex, and also very deep within the brain. TMS and TES are limited in that you have to stimulate the very surface of the brain first before you go deep. There's ways to use ultrasound potentially where you could focus very deeply but not have much of an effect superficially. That allows us potentially to do something like deep brain stimulation. When I started out, I said how good it is, but how dangerous it is. With ultrasound, you may be able to do something similar to that, but without the danger involved in poking a hole in somebody's skull, and without the expense. So Jay Sanguinetti, who's in the comfy chair up here, has been working with me for the last year, and we're setting up an ultrasound lab. So moving forward, I'm really excited about the potential of this technology. So also, just briefly, I'm also very excited about the combination of stimulation and imaging. Our study has one of the largest effects of any study out there with TDCS. I think it's because we use neuroimaging first. And the combination of neuroimaging and neurostimulation together, I think it could be really powerful. To promote that, for the last 3 years, I've organized and held an international meeting for people interested in the combination of neuroimaging and neurostimulation. And this year we're doing it in Vancouver. And we have a lot of great speakers, including Marvin Bixen. Hopefully his son will be better by then and he'll show up. And then also in New Mexico, we're having a meeting early October on clinical applications of TDCS for the most part. That's October 4th through 6th. And a lot of good speakers there as well. And it's right before Balloon Fiesta. If you haven't been, you should go. It's a great, it's a wonderful time. So Thanks to many people involved in these studies, and thank you for listening.
Vince?
Yep.
Great talk. We have about 5 minutes for questions. There's going to be some microphones that are passed around, so just come up to the mic if you have a question. Okay, or point at Stu and he'll come to you.
Thank you so much for a wonderful summary of your work. I was curious with your studies and some of the other TDCS ones that were reviewed, how many of those were placebo-controlled?
They're all placebo-controlled to some degree. We've tried both single and double blind, and in our hands, it doesn't seem to matter single versus double blind. Yeah, they're all the ones that aren't pilot studies are blinded. Yeah.
Thank you. Is there any work on people in pain and on pain relief?
For treating pain? Yeah. Actually, one of our grad students at UNM just completed her dissertation combining mindfulness with TDCS for pain and found a small effect, not a huge one. But I'm really excited about the possibility with, opiates being the primary mode to treat chronic pain is insane. It causes chronic pain. It doesn't treat it. We don't have a good treatment for chronic pain, and 100 million people in the United States alone report having chronic pain. It's a huge problem without a good solution. I'm hoping that stimulation might provide that. By disrupting the pain pathways, it appears that you can reduce people's perception of the pain. So yeah, potentially there could be something there, but we still have to make it work as good as opiates for anyone to take it seriously, I think. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. What's your experience with side effects? I just remember taking part in a transcranial magnetic stimulation at college times and having a headache for 2 days after that. Is that something that you encounter also in these studies?
So the TDCS causes a headache?
Well, there was a correlation. I can't say that it was a cause, but in my case, I would guess it was a cause, yeah.
There's 12 major side effects of TDCS, and headaches are one, although they're not hugely common in my experience. Maybe 1 in 20, 1 in 30 people get headaches. It's not clear what the reason is for that. It might be because it could be affecting blood flow, and that change in blood flow is causing irritation, and that hurts, Yeah, so some people report that. Itching, heat. About 2% of the people we give it to feel so much somatic stimulation that they ask us to stop. About 30% can't feel it at all, and the other 68% are somewhere in the middle, So, but as far as side effects go, they all remit relatively quickly. They don't last. I don't know of anyone that's gone to the hospital because of TDCS. But yeah, there are some side effects.
Thank you.
Is there any attenuation or tachyphylaxis of your treatment effect? I would imagine that given a lot of stimulation, that plasticity would sort of roll back to just a new balance and reduce the effectiveness.
It's not well studied yet. Multi-day repeated trials in the same individuals. I'm not aware of that many studies like that yet. We need NIH to start funneling more money into this to be able to pay for things like that. I know people have proposed it and been shot down. So I don't know. But do you want permanent hyperplasticity, or do you want a period of plasticity, maybe along with training, to alter the nervous system, and then the plasticity to go away, and the new form of the nervous system, a healthier form, is the one you're left with? That would be ideal if we could achieve that,
Just a quick question. You have taken consideration that the brain itself is also radiating alpha, beta, gamma rays coming out from the brain. Have you taken consideration of this effect that is to be compared with the people who are having their own radiation and aura coming out from the brain?
I'm not sure I heard the middle part. The gamma rays, did you?
Yeah.
Oh, I have no idea. Sorry. About gamma rays, 'cause it's cool. I don't know. I have no idea.
Does the current go through the brain or around the surface?
It does both. So electric current follows the path of literally least resistance, you know. So it looks like 5 to 10% of the current placed on the scalp enters the brain, which doesn't sound like a lot, but really it's titrated in terms of mechanism and in terms of safety, not wanting to get too much current that might do damage. What we apply, even if most of it got in, is still about 1 to 10% of what we think it would take to actually cause damage. But people are hesitant to go too high, partly because it starts to hurt. It starts to stimulate pain receptors in the skin, and then becomes uncomfortable. So that is a limiting feature as much as anything. And that might limit the effect, not being able to get enough current in to really change brain activity. But again, in our hands, applied the right way, for long enough, and so on, we do see effects. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vince. Our next speaker is Dr. John J.B. Allen, who is a distinguished professor at the University of New Mexico. And Dr. Allen has developed some very nice methods for studying mood and emotion disorders, things like EEG, fMRI, heart rate variability. But he's also done some other interesting research with methods like EEG and lie detection, EEG biofeedback. And today what he's going to talk about is using ultrasound as a non-invasive brain stimulation method. He's been part of a team with Dr. Hammeroff, who's done some of the first studies in humans, and so he's going to show you some of that data today.
Thank you, Jay, for that nice introduction. But although everything happens in New Mexico, I don't work at the University of New Mexico. I'm at the University of Arizona, but I like to collaborate with the University of New Mexico. So this talk I'll be giving, but Jay could just as easily be giving. We kind of do this talk back and forth, and we've been collaborating on this work for some time, so a big shout out to Jay. And I'll be talking about transcranial ultrasound today and its ability to alter mood. So I come to this from the perspective of being a clinical psychologist, a research clinical psychologist and psychophysiologist, and interested in treating things for which there are many treatments that are not fully effective, things like depression, things like anxiety disorders. And we were fortunate enough to run into the possibility of using transcranial ultrasound when Jay and I were involved in trying to get some deep brain recording during a deep brain stimulation operation. And Stu Hammerhoff was working in the anesthesiology capacity, and we ran into Stu and he said, "Hey, you got to come and see this. I've been using ultrasound to modulate brain activity." And it piqued our curiosity, and we started going down this path. So also a big shout out to Stu. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this in terms of neuromodulation. And actually, I think much of what we talk about as stimulation might more appropriately be termed modulation, because we're not generating action potentials. We're not stimulating activity with much of what we do. In fact, the transcranial direct current stimulation alters the propensity for future neural firing, but it's not directly stimulating action potentials at the levels that we administer these transcranially in humans. Now, it is possible to stimulate action potentials directly with these technologies, but that's not what we tend to do in humans. So we set the stage for neuromodulation, and then things unfold from there. Okay. And I'll talk about this, of course, at the Consciousness Conference, but mostly from the perspective of altering people's mood, and that, of course, has many effects on consciousness. This has become quite a hot topic in treating mental disorders, neuromodulation in psychiatry, in an edited textbook, for example, and there's lots of push to try to use it to get rid of things like depression, chronic pain, anxiety, promote wellness, health and well-being, and this isn't even addressing the consumer market. There are many technologies out there. Vince talked about deep brain stimulation, which certainly isn't a frontline treatment, but often a treatment of last resort for people who have been treatment refractory. It's used for taking care of tremors in Parkinson's. It's been used to treat depression in treatment refractory patients. It's being used in OCD to reduce obsessions, for example. But it's an invasive procedure and not one that many people would want to use. If we can accomplish the same thing non-invasively, this would have distinct advantages. And the two that get talked about most and make everybody feel happy is transcranial magnetic stimulation and transcranial direct current stimulation, to a lesser extent transcranial alternating current stimulation, which you've just heard about. TMS induces electrical currents in the brain by creating magnetic currents outside of the brain. And when you induce a magnetic current, when you create a magnetic current, you induce an electrical current. So you can stimulate activity using TMS, and you can cause finger flicks and visual illusions, for example. TMS is a bit expensive, and one of the big problems with it is it does not penetrate very deeply into the brain. So it's easy to stimulate regions in the cortex, but certainly going deeper into the brain poses many more challenges. TDCS you just heard a lot about. It's quite inexpensive, fairly easy to use, and if used with the right precautions, is a highly safe procedure, and it can distribute current widely throughout the brain, and depending on the montages, can get a fairly focal region using high density montages like the one that Vince talked about, where you have multiple anodes and cathodes in the same montage. I'll be talking about transcranial ultrasound, and this can range anything from a wide beam clinical scanner, we'll talk about our first study using one of those, to a very focused transducer like the one illustrated here in this cartoon, where a focused transducer can focus the energy to a very specific point, and so it might be able to have something on the order of millimeter resolution within the brain from a transcranial emitter. Okay. And we've termed this TUS, which also happens to be our airport designation in Tucson. Okay. So to talk about ultrasound, we should talk about what it is. It's sound pressure waves, just like the sound pressure waves that we hear when we hear sound, except these are above the threshold of human hearing. And so anything below 20,000 hertz is considered to be, audible, and above 20,000 hertz is considered to be ultrasonic. There are a few frequency considerations when we're thinking about using this transcranially. Lower frequencies, and when we're talking about lower frequencies with ultrasound, we're talking about things about 1/2 megahertz or 500 kilohertz. Those are going to penetrate the skull much better. The lower frequencies pass through the skull. This is the biggest impediment to the ultrasound energy going in. But they also produce a poorer spatial resolution. On the other hand, that poor spatial resolution might be on the order of 3 millimeters at a 1/2 megahertz waveform, which for many purposes, that's still pretty good spatial resolution. Higher frequencies won't penetrate the skull as well, but they can have extremely precise localization, precision on the order of maybe 15 nanometers if you're going at 100 megahertz, but it'd be difficult to deliver that energy through the skull. And that's the threshold for human hearing. Now, we're using pulsed focused ultrasound, so for a moment let me focus on the pulsed part of ultrasound, that instead of giving a continuous ultrasound waveform over time, it comes in bursts. It's pulsed. We've been pulsing it at 40 hertz, but you can pulse it at any number of different frequencies. So you can see that there's a burst of energy, and then a blank period, a burst of energy, a blank period, and so on. And that's the pulse repetition period. So I'll be talking about delivering 500 kilohertz, 1/2 megahertz ultrasound at 40 hertz pulsed. Okay? That gives the tissue time to dissipate heat in between, which is a real advantage in terms of being able to continue to deliver ultrasound, because one of the biggest concerns is heat. This just shows, again, the pulsing, and the duty cycle is you could pulse something, for example, at 40 hertz and have that pulse be very brief and have no energy for 99% of the time between pulses. That would be a duty cycle of 1%. Or you could have a duty cycle of 90%, where 90% of the time between two pulses, the waveform is on. Turns out that duty cycle matters in terms of whether this will have a stimulating or inhibiting effect on neural activity. And these low duty cycles have facilitative effects, and higher duty cycles have inhibitory effects. And therefore, if you have a theoretical model that suggests you want to facilitate activity or suppress activity, you could change the duty cycle accordingly. This just shows, using the location that I'll be talking about later, a location over the right inferior frontal gyrus, the modeling of the focused delivery of energy using a single focus transmitter. And you can see right here, we've got activity that, you can see it through this range, but it's really maximal right here in a few millimeter range that happens to be in the right inferior frontal gyrus, which was our area of interest. The focusing of the ultrasound can happen by one of two methods. One of them is by using multiple emitters of ultrasound, and by phase aligning them. If you don't phase correct them, you just get a jumble of activity. By phase aligning, they all in a single spot, the phase aligns, and you create much more energy in that single spot, and that becomes a very focused area of energy delivery. The other method is through a focused transducer. It's kind of like a concave emitter, and then again, it focuses at a very specific spot. So you can see here that there's greater acoustical pressure as you get closer to the focal spot. That also leads to more possibility of tissue heating, which we'll be staying away from in these human studies. To show that it actually is creating effects and penetrating the brain, there have been a couple of nice studies looking at modulation of evoked potentials. And the first of these was by Ligon and Jamie Tyler and colleagues, looking at median nerve stimulation, so putting an electrical pulse on the median nerve. Aside from being rather unpleasant, it creates a nice evoked potential. And this was performed by targeting ultrasound over the primary somatosensory cortex, where the median nerve stimulation fibers would terminate. And you can see here that the evoked potential is modulated so that there's a decrease in the evoked potential in the earliest component when you deliver ultrasound, but not when you deliver sham. So it's modulating the evoked potential and the perception of that painful stimulus. Okay. Similarly, in the visual domain, Lee and colleagues published a paper where they used MR-guided delivery of ultrasound to primary visual cortex. A majority of these subjects actually saw phosphemes when they did this. They had a fairly high level of intensity. And you can see here again, they've modulated two components of the visual evoked potential when they have ultrasound, but not when they have the sham waveform. So both of these would suggest the energy is in fact penetrating the skull, being delivered to the target, and altering function in that region. Okay. In terms of what's going on, there's still a lot of work being done to figure out the exact mechanisms of what's happening, and it's probably dependent on the wide parameters that we have in terms of frequency and energy and delivery parameters. But Jamie Tyler has a model that talks about this being a biomechanical mechanism where there are perturbations in the membrane bilipid layer that cause small and stable cavitations, if done at low energy, that alter membrane permeability. So what about safety? I've talked about thermal effects. I want to talk about them just a little bit more. But there are some things that are just not safe. Clearly unsafe. I don't know how they decide who gets the helmet in this picture. And some things are just unsafe. Okay. With non-thermal, low-intensity ultrasound, fortunately, this is not one of the things that is unsafe. Okay. And there are FDA limits that if we stay below that, then the possibility of heating is all but eliminated. Within these limits, ultrasound has a history of over 80 years of safe medical imaging use. The FDA guidelines are lower for fetal ultrasound imaging than they are for adults, but that's on the order of 720 milliwatts per centimeter squared in the adult, and that's all tissues, including the brain, except for ophthalmologic imaging, they have lower thresholds. Okay? But the two safety concerns we have are heating and cavitation bubbles. The heating occurs is if there's too much energy over too short a time in too small of a region. That heating can lead to the brain tissue heating up and in fact create a thermal lesion. That's obviously not desirable in the kinds of human studies we're talking about. Cavitation bubbles also come from too much energy being delivered, and those cavitation bubbles become unstable and they explode, and that would cause neural damage. Now, thermal US has been used for lesioning. This is just a cartoon of using it for body imaging of lesioning a locus in the liver, but there are also groups working on the idea of trying to tackle the problem of non-operable tumors, for example. So this just shows 1,000 different ultrasound emitters around the skull, none of them emitting a thermal dose of ultrasound, but all of them having a focused beam. And where they all focus in one single spot down there in red, that heats the tissue up to 50 degrees Celsius and creates a thermal lesion. So if this technology really becomes, I don't know what phase of the waveform we're in, but we're really in the excitement phase here. If this would become widespread, the word inoperable might be something of the past. Okay. But the parameter space is huge, probably just as large as with TDCS. Here are just a few parameters that we can think about that are known to have important effects in terms of the effect of ultrasound. We've got the acoustic frequency of the ultrasound itself, which typically ranges somewhere from 0.5 megahertz up to about 8 megahertz. The acoustic intensity, which tends to be on the lower side and well below the FDA limit of 720 milliwatts per centimeter squared. And by the way, if you're reading this literature, there are different methods of producing this. This is the spatial peak temporal average. There's also the spatial peak pulse average. And you have to be careful which one you're looking at because they end up looking quite different than each other. The duration can range anywhere from very short pulses of ultrasound. In like the studies I just talked about looking at modulating visual evoked potentials, there's just one single pulse of ultrasound surrounding the time of the stimulus presentation, all the way up to something like 60 minutes if you're doing a complex imaging protocol. And the length of time for that is dependent upon how well the heat can dissipate over time. So depending upon the mechanical index that you get, which is related to the thermal index and how well things can dissipate, you might be limited to a few minutes or maybe go up to 60 minutes, for example. And then finally, I talked about the duty cycle, whereas low duty cycles seem to have a neurofacilitative effect, high duty cycles seem to have a neurosuppressive effect. Okay. So I'm going to talk here now about the first human ultrasound brain study. This one was done by Stu Hammerhoff, and this was the study he was talking about when we ran into him in the surgical suite. You can see it's a safe procedure. He looks about the same today as he did back then, acts about the same today as he did back then. And one of the questions people have is it penetrating the skull? And the nice thing about these clinical imaging scanners, the ones that were used in this first study, is you can get a picture of the brain. And by MRI standards, it's not a great picture of the brain, but you can clearly see there's skull, and you can see regions within the frontal lobe here. So the energy is not only passing in, it's interacting with the tissue and echoing back as well. So this is passed through twice. Okay? So energy gets in. Hammerhoff and colleagues were looking at trying to reduce pain in patients with chronic pain. He was, I think, what we'd call aggravatingly close to a significant effect for reducing pain. But what he did find, and what really captured our interest, was an increase in mood using the visual analog mood scale. And so then these are the studies we've followed up since that time. Okay? So one of the questions becomes, where should we focus the focused ultrasound? And in the study that Stu conducted in 2012, he was using the temporal window, which has the advantage that it's the thinnest portion of the skull, so the most energy will pass through, and he was using the side contralateral to pain for stimulation. So that's certainly a nice area to go for. Turns out some of the work that I've been doing leading up to this also pointed to regions of the inferior frontal gyrus as potentially important, and they lay right under the temporal window. So I'd been doing work on an EEG marker known as frontal EEG asymmetry, trying to identify people which might be at risk for depression. It's a marker that's been used now in hundreds of studies relating it to mood, emotion, mood regulation, and risk for psychopathology like depression and anxiety, without us really knowing from where it originates. And that's one of the problems with EEG, is it's spatially pretty nonspecific. But we were able to do a simultaneous EEG and MRI study where we had people sitting at rest in the scanner, recorded EEG, while we also recorded MRI activity. And then we looked at resting state network connectivity using MRI. So Vince mentioned this very briefly, but network connectivity asks the question, if you identify a seed region, let's say it's your area of interest is the subgenual ACC, which is important in depression treatment, for example, and you watch how the bold signal changes over TRs, you can find other voxels in the brain that also track that. And so they're correlated. And it suggests a functional connectivity. There may not be a direct anatomical connectivity, but those regions co-activate. When one is more active, the other is more active, and vice versa. So we get these maps of functional connectivity. So we took a look at a map of functional connectivity seeded based on the subgenual ACC, since that was of interest to us in depression, and asked, are there any regions in the brain, any regions of this connectivity map that relate to frontal asymmetry? And the answer was, yes, indeed they were, and they were in the inferior frontal gyrus. And so that seems to be a region that links these two kinds of measures, resting state functional connectivity in MRI with anatomical precision, to this EEG measure that shows promise as a marker of risk for depression and a good marker of emotion regulation. So we started thinking about the inferior frontal gyrus as our place to target, which, as I said, is handy because that's also underneath the temporal window, and it's also the location that was used in the Hameroff et al. Study in 2012. Tends to be an asymmetry in the inferior frontal gyrus, such that the right inferior frontal gyrus comes up in imaging studies that look at tasks in which people have to inhibit their behavior, go, no-go tasks, stop signal tasks, in tasks where they try to suppress unwanted thoughts, or tasks where they engage in emotion regulation or need to shift their attention to some new location. Whereas the left IFG comes up again and again in language tasks and self-referential processing. So we thought if we're trying to activate something that might be beneficial for mood, rather than having people dwell with self-referential processing on the self, which, especially in cases where people may be feeling some mood disturbance already, we probably would rather have them exerting cognitive control and emotion regulation. And so the right side was the side that we went for first. So, you know, as Vince mentioned, there's a huge consumer market for neuromodulation as well. And the Think device that I'll talk about using, they also have a consumer product that's not TUS. But you know, you look at these marketing approaches, and you see, you know, they show you this person. You say, "Wow, if I do that, I can look like that, right? I can have a relationship like that. I can have a body like that." By the way, this must have been the first Google image that popped up when we searched for this, right? Because yeah, you've seen her before, right? Not here though. Okay, so the first of our two experiments, behavioral experiments, we did using the GE clinical device. And actually with Stu's help, we arranged to take this out of the operating suite when they were done for the day, wheeled it over and ran our study. Two studies with this device. The first one was just to determine the optimal parameters. The device could run at 2 megahertz or 8 megahertz. We thought 2 megahertz should pass more energy and therefore be a better setting. This was a non-blinded study just to establish the parameters. And then in experiment 2, we tried to rule out expectation and placebo effects and did a double-blind control study with, spoiler alert, 2 megahertz. It was better in study 1, and for 30 seconds of stimulation. And in both studies, this site is the right inferior frontal gyrus. We measured mood, as did Hameroff et al., using the visual analog mood scale. Asked people to quickly evaluate their mood. We got their mood at baseline, we stimulated, got their mood again, and then got it at 15 and 30 minutes later. Okay. This we see in the 2 versus 8 megahertz study, that at 15 minutes following stimulation, there is in fact an increase in global affect, an improvement in mood for the 2 megahertz compared to the 8 megahertz. So moving on then to the placebo-controlled design on the right side, you can see that 2 megahertz now in a placebo-controlled fashion beats placebo or sham ultrasound, and there's an improvement in mood at 15 and 30 minutes later. Now that was a pretty non-focused device, so it was certainly passing wide beam of energy to large regions, including the inferior frontal gyrus. We were able to team up with a startup company, Think. Izzy Goldwater is the CEO, and Jamie Tyler, the scientific officer and now a professor at the University of Arizona. This device has a small focused ultrasound transducer and a control box here. The control box lets us dial in parameters that we'd like to change, but it also has limits so that you keep the energy level below anything that would be harmful. This just shows how it would go. We would actually mark the location on the head using an EEG cap, find F8, for example, and then place the transducer up there. This just shows the model for where we believe the energy was being delivered. And with the U+ device, we once again replicate what we saw before, is an increase in positive affect over the course of about 30 minutes in those receiving the active ultrasound and not in those receiving the placebo. So now in over 100 subjects in 3 different studies, we see this effect. Okay. In terms of site specificity, we also looked at a few other sites. The site I've been showing you is this site here, the right inferior frontal gyrus. We also did the vertex using ultrasound. This just shows the model there. And depending on how that transducer is aimed, we can actually have energy focusing fairly far down. So it's kind of an interesting proof of concept. We didn't get any mood improvement at the right side. We didn't get any mood improvement at the vertex. There seems to be a site specificity to this effect as well, which again makes you a little more confident that it's not just placebo effects. But we haven't seen what it's actually doing to the brain, and that's the last part of my talk. I will talk about resting state functional connectivity. And in this study, I should mention in terms of connectivity in mood disorders, there seem to be a couple of findings that come up again and again in mood disorders. One of them is there's reduced coordination in systems of cognitive control that would allow people to downregulate emotions when they are feeling particularly bothersome, and instead they get stuck in kind of an internal and perceptive thought and have difficulty in emotion regulation. And then there tends to be a hyperconnectivity in what's known as the default mode network. And it turns out in depression, the default mode network connectivity predicts the length of depressive episodes, so greater connectivity, longer length of episode. It's also seen in anxiety disorders, and it's also related to tasks where people engage in self-relevant processing like rumination, worry, and self-criticism. So that would be a nice target to see if we could affect activity in either the cognitive control network or the default mode network. Now, in a meta-analysis of network connectivity in major depressive disorder, you can see that there's this is by Kaiser et al. I don't seem to have the reference on the slide that I thought. It's Kaiser et al. 2015. There tends to be an increase in default mode connectivity and a decrease in a cognitive control network they're calling the frontal parietal network, and also some differences in terms of their interactions between them that would allow downregulation of the default mode network. There's the reference, Kaiser, Andrews, Hanna, Wager, and Pizzagalli. So for this study, we got 9 individuals, and we had them come in and we got resting state MRI. We then brought them out of the scanner to administer the ultrasound, although in principle you could do this in the scanner because there are MR-compatible ultrasound transducers. We just didn't happen to have one. Then they went back into the scanner, and about 30 minutes after the time of the ultrasound, we got another resting scan, and we could look for changes in network connectivity. Now, first, it's worth mentioning that it's worth mentioning that the same mood effects we saw in the other studies, we also saw in this study. So the red line is from the study that I just mentioned a little while before, using the U+ device in the behavioral study. The green line is this study. You see, again, we see an increase in positive affect over the next half an hour or so. Okay. Now, here we see the changes within the default mode network. This is seeded by the posterior cingulate cortex, a fairly common seed for identifying this network. And you can see downregulation in the default mode network from before to after the ultrasound. You can also see changes in the cognitive control network that reflect increases in cognitive control. And finally, you can see changes in an affective network where you see decreases within the affective network. Now, the nice thing about this is all of these are changes in directions opposite to those that have been described as being aberrant in depression. So they'd be in the direction you would expect to be therapeutic and suggest maybe these are appropriate therapeutic targets for neuromodulation approaches such as ultrasound. Just a little more specifically in terms of the default mode network seed, you can see specific decreases with the right frontal gyrus, the precuneus, and the right cingulate cortex. And one of the interpretations we have is this is related to a decrease in self-related processing as a function of the downregulation of the default mode network. Okay. If you just look at the connectivity pattern more generally from the seed of the IFG to other areas, and I know you can't see that there, but these are just different regions of the brain, and what I want you to see with those 2 red circles is that there's decreased connectivity with the inferior frontal, or the posterior cingulate cortex and the subiculum, decreased connectivity with subgenual ACC, and decrease with medial prefrontal cortex, suggesting this IFG target has showing decreased connectivity with parts of the default mode network. Now, I should mention also that this was not a controlled study. We just had 9 people pre and post, but we had 30 other subjects, healthy subjects who'd been screened for psychopathology, who underwent 2 resting state assessments, also separated by about a half an hour. The only difference is they did a dot probe task in the middle. And we did the same analysis looking at changes in network connectivity. We found no changes in the default mode network and there were just trivial changes in the cognitive control network, and they didn't map onto the changes that we saw here in the cognitive control network. So it suggests that time alone is not accounting for the effects that we see here. Okay. So by way of synopsis, transcranial ultrasound to the right inferior frontal gyrus can produce positive mood effects. That's been shown now in 3 different studies. In fact, if you were at the Consciousness Conference in Helsinki 2 years ago, you might have also experienced in a non-formal study alterations due to ultrasound. We were giving it out there. The changes are site-specific. It seems to be specific to the right inferior frontal gyrus and not these other control locations we didn't expect, although you might think about other locations to target that would be part of the default mode network and try to downregulate activity directly. I should mention here, when we look specifically at the inferior frontal gyrus and ask the question, is the bold signal increasing or decreasing from before to after ultrasound, we find several clusters within the inferior frontal gyrus, the right inferior frontal gyrus, that are have a significantly larger bold signal following ultrasound than beforehand. So we think we're having an activating effect on the right inferior frontal gyrus. And then in terms of fMRI connectivity, this activation of the right inferior frontal gyrus seems to have effects on several different important networks for mood and mood regulation. So at this point, I think it's reasonable to think of low-intensity ultrasound as a safe and non-invasive approach for neuromodulation. It can work alongside other methods like TMS and TDCS. It does offer some advantages over the established methods. It can be focused for very high spatial resolution, and therefore you can reach deep brain structures. In fact, Jay mentioned during the workshop the other day, the group up in UCLA targeted the thalamus and found that right after targeting the thalamus, a patient who had been in a comatose state regained some degree of consciousness. It doesn't cause sensations on the skin. It's ultrasound, you can't hear it. The only thing you might hear is if it's using pulsed ultrasound, you might get clicks at the time of the pulsing, but there's really nothing that you feel. And also, you can ultimately use this to do some brain mapping while you're doing your neuromodulation. So our future directions are looking at a clinical trial to try to alter mood symptomatology, a double-blind RCT where we would treat people on multiple days over a period of about 6 weeks and get pre and post assessments of resting state MRI as targets of intervention so we could see if ultrasound produces changes in depression or worry, for example, are those in fact mediated by those changes in resting state functional connectivity as we think they should be. And of course, all of this is resting state, and just like Vince was saying, if we set the stage for neuromodulation, what people are doing while that stage is set may indeed matter. And so we could think about trying to enhance the impact of other kinds of therapeutic interventions. A study I hope to undertake next year will be using ultrasound before regular clinical psychotherapy sessions using cognitive behavioral therapy. So perhaps setting the stage to be more receptive to the emotion regulation skills that are required during cognitive behavioral therapy. This work certainly couldn't be done alone, and so you recognize some of the players, Jay Sanguinetti and Stu Hammerhoff. Jamie Tyler has been instrumental in helping us with some of the ultrasound devices, and his team, Tomo and Suman, and then several people at the University of Arizona who have been instrumental in helping us to run these studies. Thank you.
Okay, so we have about 2 minutes for questions, if there's any questions.
This is no longer working. I think it needs battery.
I was interested that neither you or the previous speaker talked about vagal nerve stimulation, since it's been approved since 2005,
Right.
and there are now non-invasive ways of providing vagal nerve stimulus, and it has been shown to affect many of the parameters that you've been describing and he described. The interesting thing for me is that when you get 10th nerve retrograde stimulation, you're probably not doing as much to higher areas as you are to raphe, maybe locus coeruleus, but you get changes in resting state potential and a lot of other issues, and they've shown significant Hamilton scale differences with those. With your doing that, I wonder whether a synergy between below,
Bottom up and top
and
down. Yeah, I
above.
think that's a very interesting question, and certainly adding vagal nerve stimulation would not be contraindicated in any way. It shouldn't conflict with the mechanism of transcranial ultrasound. it's relatively inexpensive. When I was at the Brain Stimulation Conference in March, there were just a handful of posters on vagal nerve stimulation. So I think it still hasn't enjoyed the same popularity.
It works great for epilepsy.
Yeah, right.
So to what extent does deep brain stimulation affect the blood-brain permeability?
To what extent does deep brain stimulation?
Affecting the blood-brain barrier permeability.
Okay. So, well, with transcranial ultrasound, you can use it with microbubbles to temporarily open the blood-brain barrier for passing drugs through. But that's a higher intensity approach than the low-intensity ultrasound that we're using. So at the intensity that we're using, it's generally accepted that we're not altering any aspect of the blood-brain barrier, which is an important safety concern.
So I think this is really very interesting because if you look at the history of depression and electroshock therapy, it's always struck me as like an elephant in a porcelain shop. They say, oh, people feel better, yeah, for a short time, and then they get worse again and their brain cells die. If you look clinically at what depression is, it's a sinkhole. It's an attractor. And that's why talk therapy by itself doesn't perturb it enough to get it out. And so it seems to me that this is really a brilliant way to approach the whole concept, you perturbing it electromagnetically in essence. And then if you combine it with cognitive therapy aimed at perturbing this, I'm worthless, it's hopeless, it's the perseverative thoughts. And I don't know if you can generalize that to anxiety, but for depression, it seems to me that this is really a new
I think
frontier.
that's a very good point. And I think you can think of perseverative thought as encompassing rumination in depression, the things you just listed, worry in things like generalized anxiety, obsessive thinking in things like OCD. They share a lot of common features. It's unintended, it's intrusive, it's unproductive, and ultimately, it interferes with what people are trying to do. And all of them, like you say, they get stuck in a sinkhole. Each of their sinkholes are a little different, but I don't think of the default mode network as being valence specific. It's about a process, and I think it is about that process of this self-focused, internally directed thought, and it may take any of those forms.
It's an improvement over electrotherapy because that was
I would hope
just
so.
shaking. I mean, it was just way
Although
too...
that is still used in
It is, but if you
treatment
look at
refractory
what
patients.
happens, they say, oh, they feel better. Sure, they feel better for a while, and then they get depressed again. It doesn't cure anything,
Right.
and it kills brain cells. So if you can find another way that's a lot more focused and a lot less...
You're probably preaching to the choir here, yeah.
You want to comment on the Alzheimer's work from Australia, John?
Yeah, so there was a mouse model of Alzheimer's where they also delivered a much higher doses of ultrasound and found a decrease in plaques, decrease in tangles, and increase in memory performance in the mouse model of Alzheimer's. So it also suggests it may have some neurotrophic effects as well.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
So we're going to switch back to the light spectrum now and talk about what I think is a really interesting method for non-invasive brain stimulation involving either red light or, I think in this case, near-infrared light. There's actually a device that you'll get to see on stage. So Dr. Marvin Berman has been working with the Quiet Mind Foundation and I believe running the foundation. And they've published some of the first studies showing that you can use these devices to help reduce symptoms in dementia, Alzheimer's, and other populations as well. And so I think they're really paving the way for a whole new field of treatment. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I want to thank Stuart for inviting me and for the center. And I'm going to talk about the clinical application of photobiomodulation and neurofeedback. Familiarity with neurofeedback? Thank you. Familiarity with the device that makes the slides go? Oh. Push the button? Right. So I'm going to talk about the history to some degree about photobiomodulation and some of the mechanism of action, and now it works. Way to go. You got to have an AV nerd. So mechanism of action, we're going to talk about some of the measures that we use in understanding the effects of photobiomodulation and some of the findings of the studies that we've been doing. We're at the beginning of that curve. We're building excitement, hopefully, and we're looking at some of the opportunities for the future. In terms of my experience in this field, it starts with Ted Heyman, who invented the Ruby laser in 1960, and we saw the first applications in medical field in surgery in 1965. Andre Mester discovered the low-level laser, and he used it for exposure and trying to treat a tumor, and what he found was that he got an accelerated rate of healing in the incisions for the tumor, and also a considerable amount of increased hair growth, which got my attention. This spawned a wide range of studies leading to the current focus of non-coherent light. And that really is a safer and easier to use and far less expensive approach than using laser light. Gordon Dougal is a GP and an electronic engineer working in the NHS in Durham in the UK. And I met Gordon through a process of finding treatment for a patient with dementia. And Gordon had been developing an approach using 1060 to 1080 nanometer infrared light that he was delivering transcranially. And so I approached him and got him to come and treat the patient that we were working with, and saw some very dramatic improvements in the patient's condition. And so that brought us to doing research with Gordon over the last number of years in terms of clinical applications of this technology. Now, we found that at the end of these studies that we were doing, people were, instead of handing us back the devices, they were handing us their checkbook. And we said, no, we can't do that. And we realized that we needed to find a way to deliver some kind of treatment to people who were seeing improvement, but we couldn't use the prototype device. And so we found in 2015 the Vlight company in Toronto. And we've been working with them now to explore ways of applying their technology, which functions at 810 nanometers, and using that because it's FDA cleared and commercially available. Michael Hamlin is actually a pioneer in the evolution of photobiomodulation as a field, and with whom, with Paul Chazot, who is a neuroscience professor at Durham University, I've been privileged now to co-author a chapter on the integration of neurofeedback and photobiomodulation that's going to be coming out in July. In terms of history, I think the point I wanted to make here is that there's been a considerable amount of attention paid to developing biochemically determined understanding of neuroplasticity. And what I've been focusing on with the foundation is on the brain electrical field, and what is, in fact, the other side of that neuronal equation, where every neuron is, in fact, an electrochemical system, and there is a bidirectional feedback dynamic that's occurring. And so we want to understand how you, if you change the electrical, how do you change the chemical? And so photobiomodulation defined basically involves the transformation of light energy to chemical, kinetic, or heat energy, and to achieve a desired physiological result. Now, Hamlin added to that definition that photobiomodulation is the use of low non-thermal levels of visible or near-infrared light to stimulate or inhibit biological activity and tissues that are done via a photochemical mechanism without the use of a photosensitizer. And photobiomodulation applications now cover really a wide range of applications, but primarily they are involved with the alleviation of pain and inflammation, immunomodulation, wound healing, and the regeneration of tissue. But I would suggest that the optimal photobiomodulation intervention, if we could construct one, would probably promote neuroprotection. It would certainly prevent toxic protein accumulation and foster neuroregeneration and improve production of and regulation of neurotransmitters. Now, the clinical and performance and aesthetic applications of photobiomodulation have proliferated over the years, and we're just showing a small window of the opportunities that have been explored. And you can see that in terms of increasing healing in chronic wounds, sports injuries, carpal tunnel syndrome, pain reduction in arthritis and neuropathy, the amelioration of damage after heart attacks, strokes, nerve injury, and even retinal toxicity. But the focus for the foundation has been on the use of photobiomodulation in conjunction with neurodegenerative and neuropsychiatric disorders. So as a mechanism, to understand the mechanism, of photobiomodulation, we're talking about harvesting photons which can influence gene transcription activity, and that directly support neuronal recovery, and that leading to brain recovery. So the photobiomodulation mechanism of effect really centers around the activation of the chromophore cytochrome C oxidase. And it's the fourth phase in the mitochondrial respiratory train. And the IR light photons dissociate nitric oxide and then leads to absorption by the cytochrome C oxidase that absorbs the light in the red and the near-infrared ranges. The increased respiratory activity, though, consumes more oxygen, which then metabolizes the glucose and then leads to an increase in ATP production. So the other transcription factors are integrally involved in managing the extracellular signaling process and influencing the important changes in early gene expression that influence both angiogenesis, cell survival, proliferation, differentiation, and genes associated with hypoxia. And I'm particularly interested in the hypoxia aspect because of our interest in neurodegeneration, because it's been shown now that vascular hypoperfusion and inflammation are really the two main drivers in neurodegenerative processes. Now, this is a graphic that shows the photobiomodulation eliciting a chain of biochemical activity that both inhibits and facilitates protein expression and ultimately mitigates against cellular apoptosis. Now, this is one of those slides that I have to put in the deck to satisfy the more serious molecular biologically oriented people here that I've done some of my homework. However, I'm fortunate that I had Paul Chazot, who's a senior lecturer in neuroscience at Durham University, as a colleague, because he really helped me not get a headache every time I looked at this slide. When we looked at the absorption curve of light and in the pure water molecule, we saw that 810 and 1060 to 1080 have peaks that really may have different biological impacts, which we're now looking to study. And we are providing now in our clinical practice the V-Light 810 device, and that is working at a 10 hertz pulse rate. And we're using it with both an intranasal and transcranial application. The session length is about 20 minutes. The Darth Vader meets Doctor Who device is a 1068 nanometer device that is used for about 5 minutes, and it generates about 600 milliwatts of power, whereas the Neuro generates about 475. The session length for the session length for the cerebral light, which is what it's called now, is 5 minutes. Now, if we look at some of the measures that are involved in understanding the background science, we can see that here the the pre-treatment of the lymphocytes that were done here. We pre-treated the lymphocytes with IR 1068, 1075, and we can see that there was a significant difference, about double, in the rate of cell survivability between the treated and the non-treated cells. A similar study was done with neurons in culture, and when they used a nitric oxide insult of a mild concentration, it conferred, the pre-treatment of the neurons conferred a 90% protective response, whereas with a moderate concentration of nitric oxide, we got about 28%. So When we looked at pulse width and wavelength significance, the studies that was done showed that 1072 had the greatest effect on cell viability, and that there were actually there was really good evidence of what's called hormesis, or a dose response curve. And so we saw that there was a negative effect at 880, and that the 1072 diminished when it was exposed to 1268, combined with 1268. Now, cortical penetration was something that people kept bringing up, and what we found was that there was a study done at the University of Bristol, and here subjects were undergoing surgery that included craniotomy, and they agreed to have emitters placed on their scalp, and then also one placed on the dura when the craniotomy was completed during the surgery. And so there were measurements taken of the mean fractional change in detected light intensity relative to the baseline were recorded after loss of successive layers within the head. And what they found was that most of the loss was due to the skin, and there was almost no loss at all from bone or dura or CSF. And again, as was said before, the penetration was about 6 to 10% of the total light energy, and that it got down about 3 to 5 centimeters into the cortex. And for the purposes that we're talking about in terms of neurodegeneration and also the neurofeedback, we're intervening at about 80% of the pyramidal neurons by getting down to that level. Now, the new LEDs, these studies were conducted with LEDs that were probably about half the power of the one in the device I just showed you. But we're going to see whether the increase in power in the LEDs and the way of delivering the light can have a positive effect on increasing those values. This is the beginning of looking at amyloid plaque formation in the TAS-TPM mice that were used in this study, and you can see those are the main brain areas involved in neurodegeneration and dementia. And so after a year, you've got a pretty high level of plaque development. Well, when they exposed the mice to 3 15-minute sessions exposures with the light over the cage, and the cages were closed in and blocked so that the light was reflecting off the insides of the cage, and they did that again 3 times a week for 5 months. And there was a sham and there was the active 1068, 1075 nanometer exposure. And so you can see the difference between the sham and the active treatment in terms of the removal of some of the plaque, certainly the small and medium plaque. This was, in addition, showing that the treatment prevented toxic protein accumulation, right, in terms of showing the reduction in a specific neurotoxin, which was A-beta 42, and that also happens to be a precursor protein for the production of beta amyloid. So we're seeing about a 40% reduction in that protein. Both the CREB and the BDNF cycles were positively affected by this exposure as well. The area where I feel more at home is in psychology, and watching the CD1 mice working the radial arm maze was a very satisfying experience to see, because what we found was that the pretreated older kind of middle-aged mice did significantly better than the untreated middle-aged mice. But that dotted line that you're seeing is also a run of normal adolescent mice, and we knocked it out of the park. So we beat the normal adolescent mice in that regard. When we talk about quantitative EEG, we're talking about measuring EEG in 19 electrodes, and we're using a normative database to compare those readings against the norms by age, gender, and handedness. And this process is the beginning of how we would then construct the neurofeedback training protocols that we would be employing. So what we did in this study that we showed at the International Alzheimer's meeting in 2009 is that we took the data from neurology over several decades that showed that there was a decrease in the slow wave activity. I'm sorry, there was an increase in the slow wave activity and a decrease in the fast wave activity of people as they became more progressively demented. And so we constructed a waitlist design study with about 27 subjects using only neurofeedback. And we used the quantitative EEG to figure out where their areas of maximum dysregulation were, and we put the electrodes at those locations. And we then worked to reverse by decreasing training to decrease the slow wave activity and increase the fast wave activity. And we did that over 3 months, and we did that in about 30 sessions. We also split the groups so that some of the people who were doing the training were actually being trained by their caregiver in their home at different parts around the country, and some people were coming into the clinic. And what we found, that there was no difference in the outcomes between the training locations or the providers. Now, the blue area on that lower left slide is indicating the reduced slow wave amplitudes of the subjects who improved the most, and the red dots indicate the faster frequencies above. The red dots are showing the faster frequency improvements that were significant and showing increased cortical activation. These are some of the findings that we got in terms of significant improvements noted in different kinds of memory and from just the neurofeedback training alone. We were aiming it to reverse the pattern identified in neurology's research over those decades, and what we were able to do was show that a non-invasive treatment could in fact produce those kinds of results. We didn't stop the progression of dementia with biofeedback by any means. But we saw that another intervention was really needed to improve the health of the brain tissue itself. And this is where I began to think about how photobiomodulation could play a role. And it came from seeing this infrared camera image of someone before and after a regular neurofeedback session. And so I saw the increase in temperature and realized that that was an increase in cortical blood flow. So I started to connect neurofeedback to photobiomodulation that way. And it was in 2007 that I met Dr. Dougal and was able to experiment with his cerebral light technology. And Gordon works for the NHS, and he builds these devices up in his condominium in the middle of nowhere in England. And so there isn't a lot of funding for these experiments. And we were able to move slowly into gathering people together and getting them to try this technology. And so we saw marked improvement in the patient that we were treating, and so we began to test this with other people. And we found the V-Light in 2015, and that gave us the opportunity to provide, as I said, patients with something that they could take home and use after that was FDA cleared and commercially available. So what I want to show you now is a video of a live demonstration that we did at the International Society for Neurofeedback Research last year in Orlando. And we had a gentleman hooked up in the front of the room with an EEG, 19-channel EEG cap, and then we put the V-Light on his head, and we waited and then switched on the light. And what we were looking to see was, could a single LED generating 100 milliwatts of power at 10 hertz actually be able to penetrate the skull and produce an effect on the peak alpha frequency in the EEG. And can I have the AV person's help? Oh, here we go. So this is Jack sitting, waiting for the light to come on, and you can see the red is the peak alpha activity being measured by the EEG, and now the lights come on. What I actually just showed you, it's wonderful how these things work. This is the first help. Okay. That's the one I want to show you. I've got two. Yeah, there's some audio actually. Oh God, you can actually. Good, so let's take a look at Jack. We've been seeing him without the stimulation. And now what we want to do is turn the stimulation on and see what we get. Forget that. That's more like it. So what you're seeing is the propagation of peak alpha activity simply by virtue of the fact that we turned on 100 milliwatt LED at 4 locations, including the default mode. Now, so let's take a look at. So when we turned it off, that was the one that you actually unfortunately saw first. But Jack, been seeing him. Okay, I think you got the idea. That when we turned the light off, there was a real attenuation of the light after about 15 or 20 seconds. So we were looking at then the V-Light technology that was existing at that point, and they had an intranasal only 810 nanometer device. And we looked at the QEEG before and after the single 25-minute application. And what you can see is that there was a significant change both in the slow wave and delta activity and also in the amplitude of the beta activity. But what was also noticing was that the coherence measure, which is the correlation coefficient, pairwise correlation coefficient between the locations, and you can see that there was a significant reduction in some of the slow wave amplitudes, some of the slow wave frequencies, and up through alpha, there was a reduction in the hypocoherence. When we used the neuro, which was both transcranial and intranasal, again at 810, that's when we saw an even greater reduction in the out-of-range amplitudes, which is the red, and those are 3 standard deviations above the mean. And we saw that they were completely eliminated after that single 20-minute exposure to the photobiomodulation, both transcranial and intranasal. But what was also really remarkable was the almost complete elimination of any hypocoherence throughout all the frequency bands. I'm now anxious about whether any of these are going to actually work. But here's a movie of the Loretta analysis, bin by bin, frequency by frequency, that shows the effect of the single application of the neuro, the 20-minute transcranial and intranasal application. And what we're seeing is the changes in each frequency bin in terms of Loretta, which is the low resolution electromagnetic tomography, and we're seeing how that affected.
We're at 5 hertz, 9 hertz, there's 13, 15, 16, 19 hertz, 20 hertz, 22, 23 hertz, 26, 27, 28, 29, there's 30 hertz.
So you can see that there were significantly different, but increasing, as we went up the frequency band, we could see that there was an increasing level of activity in the higher frequencies. And so, again, that supported the idea that we were reducing the activity in the slower frequencies and we were increasing the higher frequencies simply by virtue of delivering the near-infrared light.
It's 1 hertz, we're at 5 hertz.
I'm going to use my finger. This is showing the results from the original, the first phase study that was done by the people at V-Light with people with dementia, and they showed a significant reduction after 12 weeks of treatment, and they were using 2 sessions a week with the neuro and 5 sessions a week just with the intranasal only. And they did that over 12 weeks and got a significant change in cognitive functioning using the 8S-Cog. That paper's in press now, I think. This is the study that we did with patients with dementia back in 2012, and we just published it now, showing that there were significant improvements after 28 consecutive days of 5-minute treatments with the cerebrolite, the big helmet. And we were surprised and pleased, and we also saw that there were changes both in the TRAILS A and B, which is measuring visual attention and task switching, and also with ideational praxis, which is also being able to hold and perform a complex set of tasks. And we also saw changes in Boston naming tests, so that was also showing different aspects of memory being affected. Now, this was only an N of 11, but it was a double-blind placebo and randomized trial. So we're looking to complete more subjects into this study and get ourselves an R21 application started. And to that end, we have a study now in Temple, Texas at Baylor Scott and White, where people with early stage dementia are being taken in and they're being given the cerebrolite to take home for 30 days. And they're going to take selfies of themselves to show compliance. And we're getting good results from that now, starting about 2 months ago. This is what we're looking to do in the clinic, and working on using Z-score Loretta neurofeedback training to augment the effects of the biomodulation. So here, I just want Bob Thatcher, if I can get it to work, tell us what that is.
Actually looking at this green dot, and the goal is to keep this green dot on as long as possible. The instantaneous Z-scores are shown here in the right, and the progress of the biofeedback is shown in this bottom screen. Top panel.
Great. We start it over.
Set in the protocol panel has been met. And so we are continuing on for about 1 minute to just demonstrate what Loretta Z-score biofeedback is like, in which we target specific problem areas. In this case, the client in this playback got a total score of 28 rewards in 1 minute. That indicates learning. We want to get somewhere between 20 and 30 scores per minute, and not too many and not too much less than that. And we want to be able to see a progression over sessions of control by the patient of the display, which indicates that learning has occurred or operant conditioning has occurred.
But what we're talking about really when we work as clinicians is the human experience. And so I wanted to show you a clock drawing test that was done by a woman coming in on day 1, and then 5 weeks later after daily administration of the near-infrared photobiomodulation only. So this was with the 1070, 1080 nanometer treatment. And that was 5 weeks. And I guess the real goal here is someone like Joan, who in 2012 was combative and resistant and agitated and basically nonverbal and unwilling to cooperate and communicate. We started the treatment with the helmet, the infrared helmet, the cerebrolite, and she did that for a couple of years along with some biofeedback. And then in 2014, we got her interested in doing more of the neurofeedback with the Z-score Loretta training. And after that, she was able to take a motorcycle ride with her husband that they had been doing for many years, and it went really well, and she had a really good time. And that's why we're engaged in this process. This is basically what it means, and this is why we're engaged in it. So the future targets are to integrate the neurofeedback training, the quantitative EEG, and the Z-score Loretta training as a guidance system for the photobiomodulation and other kinds of non-invasive technologies like TDCS and pulsed electromagnetic fields. And what we hope is that we'll be able to see a way to deliver this in home training. And that would be our goal, and also to find FDA targets for both Alzheimer's, frontotemporal dementia, Parkinson's, macular degeneration, and traumatic brain injury. We're currently recruiting subjects nationally so we can take referrals for the trials that we're doing. And these are 60-day trials, there's no cost. And we're hoping that we'll be able to build a database and be able to publish studies like those that have been previously presented. We're just at the beginning of that curve, and we're just trying to build some excitement here. So thank you for your time and your attention.
So time for one question, maybe.
Can you talk about how this treatment compares to the standard FDA drugs for cholinesterase for these conditions?
Well, the study that was done by Violite showed that compared to donepezil, there was a 7 times greater response to this treatment approach than to the response from donepezil, and with no side effects. I can go now?
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I'll go quickly. We're a little behind here. So our next speaker is Dr. Michael Rohn, who's from McLean Hospital at the University of Harvard. And his background is in physics and mathematics, and he was sort of at the beginning of the creation of MRI back in the 80s. So he is one of the world experts in MRIs. He designed the systems. He's a physicist who understands them inside and out. And recently, he's been working with low-field magnetic stimulation as a treatment for depression and other mood disorders. So thank you.
Good afternoon. Thanks for staying. Low-field magnetic stimulation is a electromagnetic treatment for depression and is characterized by a rapid response, high-frequency pulses, a global whole-field, whole-head application, and very low electric field strengths. It has a history going back several years that goes through, goes through an accidental discovery in an MRI system, some preclinical tests, and the design of a clinical device in about 2006. As a way of leading into what I'm talking about today, which is mostly network effects and imaging results, I'll just go through what we've seen clinically over the last 10 years. In the original discovery, we had 30 subjects, well, in the original discovery in an MRI system, the research assistant who was handling the subjects noticed that they came out of an MR assessment of their meds change cheerful. And she went to the director of the center, and he talked to me, and we put a mood scale on and found a significant effect. People coming out who were bipolar depressed subjects, 30 of them received this special experimental scan that had a different timing than most MRI scans. 30 of the people received that. 10 of them were given just an anatomic scan as a sham. And then we brought in 14 healthy comparison subjects, and we found significant differences between the active and the sham treatment. This was a single-blinded study, kind of put together ad hoc after the discovery. We made the clinical device and did a study in 63 subjects, some bipolar, some major depressed, and applied several tests to it. This is exploratory, so we have 4 different tests. 3 are significant after proper corrections. We see here a reduction in depression. It's important to keep these scales straight. Sometimes it can be confusing. This is a depression scale. Reductions are good. Here is a visual analog depression scale. Reductions are also good. Here's a positive affect scale, so a positive change in this one is good. We have an increase in positive affect. And here is a negative affect scale. A decrease is a reduction in depression. You can see large placebo effects in this one, and this one less so here and here. We recently finished a study where we wanted to look at the duration of the effect. That previous one had been a test of the device. Now we wanted to see what happens after 3 treatments and after 1 week. In this one, we concentrated on subjects with bipolar depression, 50 subjects. They came in for 3 consecutive daily treatments, and then they came back 1 week later for an assessment. Using a depression scale, the MADRS, which is a clinical scale used in research, we saw an improvement, a reduction in depression that was significant for actively treated subjects. Using the positive and negative affect scale, which is a research scale, we saw an increase in positive symptoms, the self-report, that was also significant. So if we treat people for 3 days and we wait 1 week, we still see some improvements. If you look at this rather complicated pair of time courses, we see how does that progress over that week. At baseline, everyone is at 0. This is a depression scale, so values that are going in this direction are a reduction in depression. This is the positive affect scale. Increases are an increase in positive affect. We have an enormous placebo response. I think this goes along with that excitement curve that we saw earlier. Everybody loves coming in and getting new technology put around their head. You have to wait a week and it starts to separate because the people who did not get a real effect start to notice that they really didn't get anything and they're upset. The positive affect is a lot stronger, and we're thinking this has something to do perhaps with the characteristics of the treatment. It's unfortunate because when you write clinically, you have to use scales like the MADRS and the Hamilton. The PANIS is something that people are comfortable with in a research sense, but to talk to clinicians, you need the clinical scales. We have an open label study. We've done 21 subjects, but 2 of them we've kept for a year now. And this is a Hamilton scale, once again, a clinical scale, depression is going down. This is our rock star, subject 3. He came in moderately to severely depressed and dropped right away and lived a normal life with us, or with his spouse, for about 6 months. Just around here, actually, he had a trigger event and a manic episode that ended in hospitalization and ECT. A month ago, he came back to us after failed ECT and had a similar response. Subject 8 has a good response, but has ongoing negative social inputs. And he comes back and makes time out of his work schedule for over a year now because he says this keeps him out of the hospital. These are the Hamilton scales. If we look at the symptom response, we can look at the positive items on the PANIS scale and the negative items. And we see that when we look at positive self-report, there's very little placebo effect there. That's why we have such a strong response here. When we look at a report of negative affect, we have a strong response. We also have a strong placebo response, which masks out any active effect. If we wait a week, perhaps we'll see more. Or if we just increase the power of our studies, perhaps we'll see more. But this is a problem, the placebo masking an active effect in some of the reports. On Monday, I talked a lot more about the placebo effect, but here I'll just note it. So what is LFMS and what is it doing? What might be happening inside the brain? LFMS is a kilohertz. It has a 500 hertz trapezoidal magnetic field that induces a 1 kilohertz alternating square pulses of electric fields. This is pretty fast. This is faster than most things that people do to the brain in a pulsed way. The device is a magnetic coil that goes around the head. The field is induced in the head. So we don't have some of the issues or the freedom of TDCS. This is a global field that surrounds the brain and goes in. Because it's an induced whole head field, it actually takes a little bit of power to pump up an inductor like that, and there's a couple kilowatts of amplifier there. So this is not a belt pack device. If you plot out LFMS on a frequency versus field strength and compare it to a lot of the other treatments, you'll see that that frequency brings it pretty far up. You'll also see that its electric fields inside the head are almost the same as TDCS. Once you look inside the brain, you've got about a volt per meter inside, although our method of administration is very different. Deep brain stimulation actually comes up very strong. It's only got a couple volts between its electrodes, but those electrodes are only a millimeter or so apart. So DBS and TMS are both strong enough to directly fire an axon. They override your white matter, they override what the brain is doing. TDCS and LFMS are too weak to be doing that. They have to be working down in the dendrites and the communication that's happening there. ECT, of course, stands by itself out here. If you do a finite element analysis of the fields of the brain, we want to see where does the electric fields from LFMS go in the head. This is a magnitude plot. Green is no field, red is some electric field, and there is no directionality information in this plot. But what we see, that's the top of the head, is that even though my coil is giving electric fields uniformly through the air, as soon as you put a head there, the head itself will shield the electric field, and only the cortex is experiencing this effect. There are no subcortical effects. There's likely nothing in the subgenual anterior cingulate in the area 25 that everyone usually does their deep brain stimulation for. I looked a little bit more at this in some detail and solved the sphere problem. As you're a physicist, you always head towards a sphere for your solutions. If you do a electromagnetic basis solution for the near fields, which is where we are, what you find is that your unshielded fields have a very large component from this shaped coil. Your shielded fields have a very different look to them. This term is pretty much canceled out, and you see an n=2 symmetry around here. That's plus and minus. It looks like that's 1 and 2 modes. And we'll come back to this in a little bit. The shape of this coil might have something to do with its effect on networks. A little background on resting state networks, which I don't have to spend too much time on today because others have already gone over it. The brain at rest has activity that's independent networks of brain regions that coactivate. These are distinct. They've been linked to different forms of cognition and affect. The executive control network is one of them. The salience network, where your brain decides how important something is one. The reward network speaks for itself, sensory motor networks, and the default mode network, which, as has been mentioned, indicates a self-referential processes and has been indicated in, implicated in depression mechanisms. The default mode looks like this. It's got a node up here in the medial prefrontal cortex, a mode back here in the posterior cingulate and precuneus, dorsal anterior cingulate, and some lateral parietal areas. Central executive has most notably dorsolateral prefrontal and frontal eye fields here, and then the lateral parietal areas. And the salience network has most importantly the insula, which kind of integrate your sensory experience and tell you how important it is. These three networks are particularly important in imaging studies of depression, and they're the ones that we'll see coming up in the imaging study that I'll show. Now, a point that I want to make during this talk is the importance of networks in the brain and the hierarchy of networks. Here's our top level network, which is brain regions observed with fMRI, resting state brain regions. We have the different brain regions that we've talked about, and they are linked, they have a connection, which in this case are white matter tracts, and they have characteristic timescales, which are 0.01 to about 0.2 or 0.3 hertz with fMRI. Now, if we look at EEG, which is another imaging result that we'll be showing, we'll see that EEG traditionally has low spatial resolution. Great temporal resolution, spatial resolution not so easy to make out, but recent developments in Loretta over the last 10 years have allowed us to see some spatial resolution up to about 5 or 10 millimeters, and we saw some Loretta results from 2 of the earlier talks. Efforts to bring the fMRI networks and EEG image networks together, they're going forward. They tend to show gamma is local regional effects, which is not a surprise, and that delta and beta, some of the middle range frequencies, are an indication of the longer range connections. So we'll be looking for that in our EEG results. Now, when you look at EEG, again, I'm stressing the network nature of all of this. The neurons in the cortex are all lining up to give you a gamma effect, gamma frequency oscillations, but the connections down to the thalamus are giving us our delta band signal for the connections. These things work together in depression to give you either strengthened or reduced connectivity between the different resting state networks. And we'll look for these effects in our imaging. In these imaging protocols, I have healthy controls. I'm looking to see if I have effects of LFMS in healthy controls that might then be studied further in depressed subjects. For fMRI and EEG, I just have 3 subjects. I wanted to get as much power as I could out of the study. So for the fMRI subjects, they went in for imaging, either active or sham LFMS for 20 minutes, and then they received resting state imaging again. They came in twice. This is a double-blinded, sham-controlled study. We have to control for just the effects of lying down for 20 minutes, for example. We looked with fMRI using 2 different imaging modes, single-band and multi-band functional scanning in each of these blocks. With EEG, we examined all the frequency bands, of course, but gamma band was what we were looking for. Resting state, eyes closed here with a 64-element net. Again, resting state, eyes closed. They came back for active and for sham sessions. We also did imaging with near-infrared spectroscopy, which is, it's interesting that you can both stimulate and observe with it. If you look at 690 and 830 nanometers, then one of those looks at the deoxyhemoglobin concentration. The other looks at the oxyhemoglobin concentration, and you can look at brain network activity that way. If we look at the fMRI results in these healthy subjects, and we do a seed-based connectivity analysis, in this case, the medial prefrontal cortex, we're finding out which areas changed their connectivity after LFMS. Now remember, we had our baseline image, then we had either active or sham LFMS, and then we imaged again, and then they came back and they had the other treatment, active or sham, pre and post, so we have 4 scans combined in each one of these for each subject. We have a reduction right in the medial prefrontal region here, between that seed and that region. We have an increase in this slide between our seed, which is part of the default mode network, and the salience network. And we have a reduction between the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex here, which is a reduction in activity in the default mode network. If this was a test of treatment effects in a depressed subject, we would say that this is consistent with antidepressant treatment. If we also look at a dorsolateral prefrontal cortical seed, bilateral, we see a reduction in this executive control network. These are strongly significant results for 3 subjects. They pass a 0.05 null hypothesis rejection using proper group analysis techniques. And we hope to do more subjects soon. If we look at the gamma band activity, we see an increase in prefrontal regions and a decrease in posterior cingulate cortex and precuneus again. And these look strikingly similar to the connectivity results that we saw with the fMRI. Our NERS scanning was exploratory using a small system that we had for 2 weeks. So we were able to look at just some dorsolateral prefrontal areas. We chose these areas because they're the treatment target for TMS. And we thought that might be a good area to look at. We find a global reduction in deoxyhemoglobin usage and a corresponding increase in oxyhemoglobin concentration occurring after LFMS. Once again, this was done in a 2-visit protocol with a sham and an active visit, pre and post resting state scans. So what do these imaging results tell us? The fMRI shows us that we have changes in regional activity that corresponds to successful antidepressant treatment in depressed subjects. The EEG shows that we have gamma band changes that also correspond to that successful treatment outcomes. And the NERS activity shows that we have a suppression of activity in dorsolateral prefrontal areas that corresponds to our connectivity with the fMRI. Altogether, these shows that in healthy subjects, we have changes in brain metabolism which correspond to antidepressant treatment. And presumably, if subjects actually have a mood disorder, these will cascade down through the networks of the brain to have an antidepressant effect. So let's go down one more level in the brain's organization and look at the cortical organization, because we want to find where LFMS might be having its effect. If we look at the prefrontal cortex, activity there is dominated by the network of pyramidal neurons with GABAergic interneurons, gap junctions between the neurons. It's a mess in there. It's a mess of signaling. The dendrites are receiving connections from different, the neurons in the prefrontal cortex are receiving communication from other neurons via chemical synapses, electrical gap junctions, and field coupling between the neurons. It's not easy to sort out which of these structures a 1 kilohertz signal might be communicating with. Once we go inside the dendrites, we'll find an even smaller network and faster network of structures. Here we have receptors, ion channels, gap junctions, and the cell membrane all communicating together in a network. The typical timescales here are less than millisecond. These are small structures, and once we've gone down this low, now we're in the same timing that LFMS is. So if we have to look for a target of activity for LFMS, it's most likely inside the dendrites within these small structures. The networks that we've looked at with our imaging studies of fMRI show us that out in the resting state brain, those networks with timescales in this frequency range have a slower effect on mood and are affected by LFMS. When we look at a smaller scale networks, we see that the pyramidal neurons in the cortex, which have a complicated network, are experiencing changes in their gamma frequencies from LFMS. And when we look down at the dendrites, we see structures that might be susceptible to LFMS. Now, LFMS is too fast to be affecting these networks. It's too fast to be affecting these networks. It's about right for these networks, but these are all connected. I mean, the brain works together. It works on several different levels. So in coming to consciousness and this conference, which is really my first encounter with this theory of consciousness and with the involvement of microtubule structures that exist right in the axon, in the dendrites, next to all these other structures. I have some questions. We have the microtubules that are suffusing the dendrites, and these dendrites are parts of networks that are parts of regional networks or parts of larger regional networks, which all support the functions of cognition and of consciousness. Does the microtubule system parallel the network organization of the neuronal system? Do we have an affective region? Do we have a cognitive control region? Do we have a salience region? Do the microtubules that are in these very well-defined brain regions perform those functions as their support of consciousness? How are the microtubules in these different neurons, how do they communicate to each other? When I look at the biological or the neural networks that I'm examining with imaging, there's axons, there's gap junctions, all these different communication methods, each support each level of network activity. Are the microtubules communicating via that or some other kind of coupling? Lastly, and most interestingly, could these imaging results be used to employ to study this microtubule network? Specifically, is there a network signature for a loss of consciousness, and could that be used to explore a testable hypothesis? Is there an imaging-based testable hypothesis for these theories of consciousness? I've learned by coming to this conference some of these new theories, and these are thoughts that occurred to me as I was going to talks over the last several days, trying to put it together with what I'm looking at in the affect and changes in mood from stimulation. So thank you.
Okay, I think you might have made some friends with that last slide.
You're going to take some questions?
Yeah, take a few questions.
Can I answer about the microtubules?
Of course.
Sorry. Thank you. Microtubules do have resonance at a kilohertz. Anirban has shown that.
Oh, really?
So everything you said is yes.
Let's talk.
Okay. Here's another microtubule.
Yeah, yes, I wanted to also address some of those questions that you had in the last slide.
Mm-hmm.
And these are just my opinions, and I'm sure Stuart has other opinions. But as far as the function, the neurons, first of all, well, let me answer, I think it was your third question. Why would some of the neurons be more involved in consciousness than others? The reason is some of them have a very dense matrix of these microtubules, and in particular, they're found in the apical dendrites of the largest pyramidal cells. So if you look at, say, a cortical module, you literally have an array of many, many packaged microtubules. And some of the thinking is that beyond any electrical membrane effects, there could be field potentials that could spread to this array of in parallel microtubule networks. And insofar as their inputs, they would receive the inputs that that particular pyramidal cell would receive through normal axonal synaptic connections. But where the difference lies, and the way I like to envision them, is more as nanowires. So you have a connectivity of the overall brain, and then within individual pyramidal cells, you have nanowires that connect different synaptic inputs. And possibly what they store in terms of memory is a mapping, kind of like a FedEx cargo mapping of where to take proteins that are synthesized in response to synaptic stimulation. Okay, that's all I had to say.
I also think microtubules may be mediating ultrasound effects, as John and I have discussed, and possibly photons. Electrical, I'm not sure.